Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, the ambassador, good afternoon. Considering the current state of the world and the situation around the pandemic, it is a truly humble experience to stand in front of you here in person and welcome you all to Saaremaa and to Kuressaare and to the main hall of Kuressaare Town Hall. We're not alone. This is a global stage. Since the event is part of the Louis Kahn 120-year anniversary, we are also being broadcasted around the world, hence the English as a sort of dominating language today. Although it is a global stage, the physical location is still Estonia. So you are bound to hear people speak in Estonian. Don't panic. We've done this for many centuries, millennia, so it's safe. And I'm going to briefly deliver the message if necessary. This event takes place due to the efforts and support from the Embassy of Norway, the Embassy of the United States, Louis Kahn Estonia Foundation, and the Municipality of Saaremaa. To open the opening address today is from the chairman of the Municipality of Council of Saaremaa, Mr. Jaanus Tamkivi. Chairman.
Austatud suursaadik, lugupeetavad daamid ja härrad, tere tulemast Saaremaa pealinna Kuressaarde osa võtma Louis Kahni 120. sünniaastapäevale pühendatud seminarist siin meie ajaloolises Raekoja saalis. Üle ilma kuulus arhitekt Louis Isadore Kahn sündis siin meie omases Kuressaares 20. veebruaril 1901 ja lahkus Saaremaalt aastal 1906. See periood ja kokkupuude Kuressaarega jäänud tal aga elus viimaseks. Ta viibis siin uuesti 1928. aastal, siis kokku paar kuud ja väidetavalt leidis öömaja siis oma vanaema juures. Arhitektina üle maailma kuulsaks saanud mees tegi küll oma elutöö elades ise USA-s, Pennsylvanias, kuid tema juured ja päris esimene algus on siin Saaremaal ja Kuressaares. See on meile tähtis ja oluline. Tõesti, ta ei ole küll Eesti arhitekt, kuid ta on siin sündinud arhitekt, kes oma töödega on saavutanud suure tähelepanu ja rahvusvahelise kuulsuse. Tema töödest on leitavad elemendid Kuressaare linnusest, samuti on ka tuttavad näiteks Pöide kirikust või Valjala kirikust. Samuti on tema valgustunnetus väidetavalt omane just meie laiuskraadidele. Täpsemalt oskavad sellest kõigest muidugi rääkida asjatundjad. Meie saarlased aga teame, et tegu on meie saare päritoluga mehega, kes suureks kasvades tegi laias maailmas suuri tegusid ja lõi väga väärtuslikku arhitektuurikunsti, mis on kestev ja lummav olnud pikkade aastate jooksul ja on seda kindlasti ka tulevikus. Ma soovin teile kõigile siin täna head, toredat ja väärtuslikku seminaripäeva. Edu teile kõigile. Aitäh!
As promised, a brief translation. Mr. Chairman sends his greetings to you all, to the ambassador, and our guests. In his speech, he highlighted that Louis Kahn is an Estonian-born American architect who achieved his success in Philadelphia. This is very important to us. In our mind, there is no doubt that Kahn was our fellow islander, because from our perspective, he was born here, went into the world and accomplished great things. This sounds very much like our kind of islander. So he hopes you'll have an interesting and fruitful afternoon. Thank you. And next, I'm honored to invite the Ambassador of Norway, Mrs. Else Berit Eikeland, to the stage.
Thank you, dignitaries, Kahn Foundation, dear friends, kjære venner. It's really a great honor for me as Norway's ambassador to Estonia to be invited to address you. My achievement is not on a personal basis. It's to bring this team, Per Olav and Emily Fjell, to Estonia. And as you know, Norway is a very, very practical and down-to-earth country, just like Estonia. So my role today has been to drive them from Tallinn and to Kuressaare. But why are they so important for the Nordics, for our identity as a Nordic region? And of course, I include Estonia in this region. For Estonia and for you here in Saaremaa. Because Per Olav and Emily have done a groundbreaking research for many years about Kahn and his Nordic influence, and his influence from Saaremaa. So sometimes we talk about people that they have shared identity. Maybe that's a modern word. Like me, I have been a diplomat most of my life, and I feel I have left part of I have gained, I should say, from every country I have stayed in. So now I'm really in love with Estonia, and I feel, I must say, I'm a Norwegian, but I'm a little bit Estonian too. And I define myself as being Estonian. So maybe it was the same with Kahn. Maybe the discussion if he's Estonian or not is not the correct discussion. That's the old-fashioned way to look at influence and nationality. He was influenced by Kuressaare, by the landscape, the light, the nature here. He grew up here, or grew up 4 years, his childhood, but he returned in 1928 to reconnect with this island. And he traveled in the Nordic countries and had a lot of contacts. So I think he's more than just an islander. He is part of the Saaremaa identity. And you can all be proud of Louis Kahn. I feel this has really kind of strengthened the bilateral relationship between Estonia and Norway, because Kahn had also close friends in Norway, architects. But also it's placing, as I said, Estonia so clearly in the Nordic region with the Nordic architecture. So my wish is, of course, for all of us to embrace this and to think about Kahn as an Estonian and a person from Kuressaare and from Saaremaa. So thank you again. This, as I said, to the Minister of Defense. I didn't address you because I didn't see you there in the corner. This is my 5th time to Saaremaa. I only stayed in Estonia like 14 months. So maybe I will start to identify myself as an islander myself, a small piece of me. Thank you so much, and I hope to come back again and again when you will organize the Louis Kahn tour around Saaremaa to look at the places which influenced him. Thank you so much.
It has been 15 years. 15 years and 1 week to be exact, when Louis Kahn Foundation arranged the first ever event here in Saaremaa. And to mark the occasion and perhaps introduce our first speaker is the chairman of the board of Louis Kahn Foundation, Mr. Toivo Tammik.
Lugupeetud koosviibijad, aastal 2004 kohtusin ma Philadelphias Eestimaa eestlaste kesknõukogu esimehe Juhan Simonsoniga, kes oli toona hea tervise juures, kes oli pärit Põlvast ja kes ütles, et tema on õppinud Louis Kahni all regionaalplaneerimist ja ütles, et tema tahaks mind viia, kuna ma olin seal külas tema juures, et tema tahaks mind viia siis Philadelphia Kahniga seotud paiku vaatama. Et ma kohtusin siis Kahni päevi ennetavalt nii kõikide selliste tähtsamate Kahni uurijatega, selle arhiivi seltskonnaga ja juba 2 aastat hiljem, aastal siis 2006, saabusid siis, nii nagu juba eelpool nimetati, saabusid siia siis Kahni 2 last, 1 lapselaps, 1 tema abikaasadest ja väga suur arv väga olulisi Kahni uurijaid ja siin oli suur konverents, et kõik see niisugune emotsioon ja see väike niisugune külavahe, nagu on see meie Eesti, et see ühel või teisel kombel liitus see Ameerika pool ja Eesti täpselt samamoodi nagu täna, kus Kahni ühing on siis korraldamas nii Kuressaares kui Ameerikas üritusi. Vahepealsest nii palju, et on olnud väga olulisi sündmusi, Eestis on uuritud Kahniga seotud siis selliseid asjaolusid ja kirjutatud üsna mitu monograafiat, et Heie Treieri eestvõtmisel. Samuti on Kahni siis sugulased jätkuvalt siin käimas ka laulupidudel ja mujal, nii et meil on temaga selline side väga tõsine. Samuti on nüüd Kahni väga oluline kaastöötaja, kellega ta veetis siis koos 18 aastat, August Komendant, et ka temaga seotud erinevaid ettevõtmisi oleme me siin Eestis näinud, et oli Komendandi näitus, me teame, et Komendant on keset Eestit Nurmsist Paide lähedalt pärit ja ka Paides hakkab tekkima midagi sarnast, nagu on siis Kuressaares juba olemas, ehk siis Komendandi huvi Paides on kasvamas ja ka Komendandi keskusest räägitakse seal. Samamoodi nagu siis Kuressaares on väga palju juttu juba Kahni keskusest. Me saame Kahni ühinguna rääkida Kahni keskusest eelkõige kui vaimsest sellisest keskusest, mis ühel või teisel kombel levitab seda infot ja seda sõnumit, mida oli geniaalsel loovisikul olemas ja kuna postmortaalselt temast praktiliselt iga aasta antakse välja üsna mitu arvestatavat monograafiat, et siis seda materjali, mida siin ka koha peal uurida ja siis maailmale näidata, oleks palju. Täna on meil 2 väga olulist külalist, õigemini 4, et meil on siin professor Fjeld, kes on olnud siis Kahniga otse kontaktides nii tema arust töötades kui ka siis temast raamatut kirjutades, samuti siis Abelardo Morell, kes on suurepärane fotograaf, samuti saarlane, Highlander, kes tuleb New Yorgist ja on Kuuba päritolu. So please join me welcoming our guests, Pierre and Emily Fjeld and Abelardo Morell. Aitäh!
This will probably sound really awkward because the translation is going to be very short. So the idea of the event started actually 2 years prior, 2006, in 2004, and it happened after the meeting Toivo had in Philadelphia with researchers. So they gathered here in 2006, and this became a tradition, and now we're continuing it. So, without further ado, Mr. Per-Olof Fjeld.
Good afternoon. Emily and I would very much like to thank for the invitation. It's fantastic to be back here, in which then we started our project, and also the generosity that the people showed us here when we have certain questions about where Khan was and what happened to him and so on. So we thank you very much for that, and also thank you for coming. I will talk through Emily and me this afternoon about the Nordic connection, his creative approach in relation to that, and of course how it's affected his architecture. We can have the light down, please. Okay, that's fine. I see you. I see you all. Louis Kahn Masterclass at the University of Pennsylvania has truly changed my life. His teaching opened up an approach to architecture different from anything I have experienced earlier. But it's also pushed me to reflect upon core cultural, social, and philosophical issues. Kahn was intense, not just in relation to architecture, but life in general. He would often comment in class that life is to express, meaning that each one of us has the capacity to create, in the hope that what we create together could strengthen our understanding and awareness of what it is to be a human being. During my student experience of Louis Kahn at Penn, I sensed something familiar in his expressions, something Nordic. But I did not fully understand it at that time, because in 1972, he was regarded as an American architect, and for the most part of the focus was upon American sensibility and perspectives. An important factor in understanding Kahn's impact was from the start of the masterclass, I kept a notebook recording all that was said in the class, and I continue this practice for the rest of my life. However, it was a personal question from Kahn early in the first semester that triggered a Nordic cert. He asked, "Do you know the Norwegian architect Arne Korsmo?" Unfortunately, I did not, as all my architectural training was in the US. I could see Kahn was disappointed, but his question haunted me the rest of the year. So when I returned to Norway and landed a job in the office of the Pritchard Prize architect Sverre Fehn, who had been a student of Korsmo, this opened up a world of Nordic-European connections, and many included some form of relationship to Kahn. And over time, this web of interconnections inspired me to dig deeper into Kahn Nordic and European ties. The book, Louis Kahn, The Nordic Latitudes, took many years before it really reached its final form. I simply was not mature enough in the beginning. There were many issues I wanted to cover, and they did not always fit together. Unfortunately, Emily began to point out other issues that we should investigate, and I had 40 years of note-taking that needed the review. However, the first time Emily and I visited Kuressaare, I became aware, almost immediately I would say, of a certain aspect that I feel are deeply rooted in Kahn's architecture and in the core context of his work. To be born on an island so far north will inevitably define on some levels interpretation of all that comes later in life. Here on Saaremaa, there is a specific identity within a clarity of place itself. And when you leave, I believe, how matter and how young, bits and pieces of your early memories will stay with you. One feature in this beautiful endless landscape connects to the sea is that any built object becomes distinct, specific in its connection to place. Both nature and the build reclaim a clear identity of its own, from the castle to the small wooden homes and to the lighthouse. Kahn's work in relation to site is very similar. Maybe this is also one of the reasons that in much of Kahn's work, you must search for the entrance, as north, south, east, and west are of equal importance. Another aspect evident is in this island landscape is a sense of silence. With this, I mean the landscape releases a reflective pause as you move through it, much like in the Scandinavian language, where the long pause between words which allow you to concentrate on a thought as you speak. And this pause has a meaning. The landscape offers you this possibility, and the same also occurs inside Kahn's architecture. And there is more that connects to his work. The architecture on the island is notably through a clear use of material, such as stone, wood, and brick, and all relying on good craftsmanship. This is very important. It was essential in Kahn's work to rely on materials that reveals the idea of mass, material that are not disguising their weight and their gravity. The word window comes from the Nordic word vindauge, means the opening where the breeze possesses your eyes. The choice of material makes a link between the structure and daylight, meaning that the size of the opening and how light enters a space. As a student, I had the feeling that I understood his search for a particular light, that its origin was from the north, and that it came actually from here. One never forgets its childhood's light. Here in the north, there is a bright, soft, golden autumn light that is framed by window in a dark room. There is an unforgiving March light that streams through the opening, or midsummer pastel evening light when its dark gray contours of the landscape. Or winter dark blue light, we know them all. His constant search for a particular light travels through his memories from the north. The last of these island influences that gave strength and direction to his architecture was a strong, pragmatic social consciousness. He was in search of an architecture in which he called the architecture of institution. An architecture that in some way could be understood, embraced and shared by everyone, and referring to his own saying that architecture should strengthen and bring forward our humanness, meaning a strong belief in a sense of consciousness. Beautiful said. He believed that architecture has the ability to strengthen and deeper our understanding of ourselves as human beings. This is Kahn. Both Emily and I sensed this collective dimension here in Kurosawa. Its earlier focus upon cultural activities that you had, schools, parks, which is admirable considering the town size. I must congratulate you on that. Outside of Kahn's daughter Alexandra's book and his son Nathalie Kahn, here you see the son and Kahn, factors that directly connects to his birthplace are seldom investigated in relation to his work. This is very unfortunate, and one of the reasons why Emily and I decided to write a book about his Nordic connection. A Nordic perspective changes and gives ever greater depth to how we understand Kahn's architecture. Kahn's family faced poverty in Philadelphia, but they also faced a foreign culture and a new language, which would take them and which would take time to learn. Kahn's mother spent much of her childhood in Kurosawa. Her education took place here. The family was educated, interested in literature, music, and a legacy of skilled handcraft within the family. He came from something. These childhood experiences and inheritances was a creative base that never really left Kahn. Of course, this argument can be challenged. Why didn't Kahn talk about his childhood or the place he was born? The answer to that question seems very simple. He had no audience, except for a few. Maybe his engineer, August Commandant, perhaps. This lack of audience in relation to his background allowed, or rather forced, this part of his life to be explored internally within a minimum of disturbance and corrections. Beautiful. Because it became an essential content in the way it came forth. And architecture then became the outlet for Kahn's inner longing and dreams. Not to be understood or nostalgic. Kahn embraced America, and this was very clear in class. But his architecture, or at least is strongly connected to a Nordic sensibility. I think the culture of the North was one of his deepest inspiration. This is inside Corman's house, the last house Kahn did. But what I now said, this is the opposite of what many contend as a pound to classical architecture in the south of Europe, but this is a too easy fit. He was able to combine numeric expression into an architectural identity of his own. But it was always an architecture in search of an unifying and inclusive voice. But as an expression, it belonged to Kahn alone, nobody else. 1906, June 25th, on the Norwegian ship Nordhaus, he comes to Philadelphia. And this was the Philadelphia Kahn met upon the arrival from the rather protected life in Kuressaare. A tough inner life. In a conversation with Gabor, a friend and part of his office later in life, he told me that Kahn's father, Leopold, never really adjusted to the new situation and had numerous attempts to find steady work, including starting up his own candy store. But his poor English was a problem. Kahn's mother, however, was often the only steady income and was the energy behind her children's integration quickly into American life. And she, independent of everything else, never stopped in believing in Kahn's talent. After high school, we entered the University of Pennsylvania architecture program, and his most influential teacher was Paul Cret, trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition in Paris. Kahn, as many of you know, was an excellent draftsman and made extraordinary money making drawings for other students. At a night, he played piano in a silent movie theater. After graduation, he freelanced in the Philadelphia City Planning Office. Unfortunately, he worked on the sequential exposition and was able to test his drawings in relation to what was actually built. During this period, he lived at home in order to save money for his first European trip. And considering the effort and lack of funding throughout his education, this clearly indicates a deep longing to experience Europe, but also the North again, to visit the land and people of his birthplace. And in 1928, at the age of 27, he departed upon his most extensive and longest European trip. I'm sure this was a complete longing for him in that sense. In May, Kahn landed in England, toured for a few weeks visiting the conventional landmark, then crossed over to Holland, Belgium, and then up to Copenhagen. His timing in making a visit to the north in relation to architecture could have not been better. The cultural and architectural change between the Nordic nations, including Estonia and Latvia, was good. And there were interesting new projects in most of the major towns. This is Bakker in Oslo. Social, cultural, and philosophical issues were clearly entering Nordic and architectural discourse. In Copenhagen, the first stage of the Grundtvig Church by Kåre Klint was completed, and the police headquarters by Kappmann was finished and had been in use for some years, and Kahn visited both of these places. This fantastic plan of the police building. Here you can see his attempt to write or break down the meaning of Copenhagen in Danish. You see also the sketch of the Grundtvig Church, and you see a small plan of the police station. In Stockholm, I think this is a 20-year-old guy. In Stockholm, the city library by Gunnar Asplund was just about finished, and both the form aspect and how the light enters the building must certainly have been an inspiration for Kahn. And the woodland cemetery just outside the city, within works from both Asplund and Sigurd Leverens, was also open. Earlier, Kahn scheduled a meeting with architect Ragnar Rösberg and visited Stockholm City Hall. And one can see his sketch from the City Hall made during that period. Also, they were just beginning to work on the Stockholm exhibition of 1930. And in Helsinki, he saw the train stationed by Sarin, and Arval Aalto, who was just working on his iconic modernist building, including the Paimo Sanatorium. Then, nearing Midsummer Night, Kahn left to Riga, where his grandmother lived, and a side trip to Saaremaa, where some of his family still resided. Imagining then this young man, the light at midsummer, when Kahn arrived at his birthplace. There is always an adjustment between what one remembers as a child and what one sees as an adult. But eventually, they melt together. After visiting his family, Kahn headed south through Germany, Austria, and finally down to Venice. And at this point, Arne Korsmo, the person Kahn asked me about in the beginning, entered the story. He was also on the study trip that late summer of 1928. From Venice, Kahn headed for Rome and met Korsmo on a train. They toured Rome and southern Italy together, and from this point stayed in touch the rest of their life. They were the same age, had many things in common, and enjoyed each other's company. Korsmo was a very good architect and an influential teacher. He was curious, outgoing, and knew many important architects at an early age. I would say some: Le Corbusier, Gropius, Aalto, Gio Ponti, just to mention some names. And as I mentioned earlier, Arne Korsmo was also the teacher of the Pritzker Prize winner Sverre Fehn, whom I collaborated and taught with for more than 30 years. The visit to Rome and Father Souls clearly fascinated Kahn. His later visit to ancient Mediterranean sites, which serves as an inspiration. But the core idea that were the foundation for early 20th century came actually from the north. What were these points? That you clearly find in his notes: a respect and understanding of nature, that the space should have daylight, any space, be attainable for many, and that the quality of the space itself, was the most essential in architecture. These issues, in my opinion, are the heart of Kahn's work and architectural creative thinking. As mentioned, the planning for the 1930 Stockholm exhibition was underway, and much of the social content that underpinned the program is reflected in Kahn's later architectural aim, such as the architecture of institution, and that good architecture should be for everyone. It is interesting to note in the Stockholm exhibition, it generated a new vocabulary, like folkhem, home for the people, or hverdagsrom, all-purpose day room. The new words indicated a shift in focus toward a better understanding and awareness of human behavior, where daily life was the focus. The exhibition would have an enormous impact on the Nordic architecture, and it was a very positive general public acceptance, quite unlike other modernist exhibitions. It was also a time in which all the crafts, for some reason, were working in the same direction. Interestingly, a few years later, the Göteborg Town Hall by Gunnar Asplund was erected. This is a good example of Nordic architecture that has a flat, inclusive social approach in line with much that Kahn would aspire to later. The prisoner, the lawyer, and visitor all use the same stair, the waiting rooms and the offices. The hierarchy of position reflected in the architecture was minimal. It was a respect for the human. There avoidance a spatial sense of entitlement or separation between its users. This annex would influence the design of many public buildings in the Nordic region. At the end of the trip, Korsmo went home and did this building, Villa Damman. He was 30 years old, and his office was going already very strong, very much different from the story that Kahn came back to later. We're going to talk about Kahn's early years in search of an architectural identity, because that's what he really was after. It is, as a young architect, it is clear that Kahn was in search of his own architectural identity, as he explored many different architectural approaches, tested, confronted each with his own architectural beliefs. He touched upon modernism and the international style, and here are some examples. You can see here, very much affected by Corbusier, the teak store, the Siedlung that he saw on his European trip, what he called the idea of the new house, or the parasol house, which these large parasols gave a certain type of protection, but under that protection you could simulate many architectural ideas that this could take about. And the emerging in the housing. You can see he went through a very different type of vocabulary in his search for identity. He worked and tested different materials and came to the conclusion that he was interested in materials that belongs to mass, such as stone, brick, but also concrete, as it left traces on how it was made. It's interesting. He concluded that steel was never to be a major material for him. It was too industrial in its making and therefore could not fully support his idea of institution, and that steel, different from brick, could fool gravity. These essences was true, very strongly embedded in his work. And he found that geometric forms, like the triangle, square, and circle, had a universality that was understood and recognized by everyone. But it is important to be aware of that these forms, the geometrical forms, would appear very late in his design, as a core idea or the concept of a project had to come first. And the core idea the expression of that was without geometry. In addition, architecture should have an order, a structural identity, but order in itself does not imply beauty, as it says, as beauty had to be generated through human creativity. Kahn also worked in different offices in this period. Eventually, he joined George Howe and Oscar Stonerow in a partnership, and one project caused very much public interest and was a turning point in some way, the Carver Court Federal Housing Project from 1944. It's not surprising that Kahn was interested in social housing and in human behavior at that time, and it was embedded in his background and mirrored all that was unfolding in the Nordic countries. And the architectural education that time was strongly influenced by Gropius, Corbusier, and Mies. By 1949, Kahn was teaching at Yale with George Howe, who was department chair. This was a very fruitful time for Kahn. Not only did the students appreciate him, but he made many new friends and acquaintances, among them Joseph Alberts from the Bauhaus and Eero Saarinen, both of whom he would continue to correspond with after he left Yale. Joseph Alberts were working at the honoring of the Yellow Square at that time, but he very much influenced Kahn's way of drawing, making his drawings much more abstract, not as representational that they were before. So in that sense, Albert was important for him during this early period. Kahn tested and presented ideas through his teaching and was soon awarded a grant to study at the American Academy in Rome. And he would revisit many of the places that he explored with Arne Korsmo on his first trip. Oddly, about half a year before Kahn left for Rome, Korsmo visited Kahn in Philadelphia, along with his wife, designer Grete Prytz Kittelsen. Korsmo had attended the SIAM meeting at Bergamo, and a few months earlier, and he was impressed with the post-war architecture centered around Milan and the Dutch architect Aldo van Eyck. It is quite probably that this SIAM meeting was discussed on some level between friends. Korsmo followed Kahn up to Yale and then continued his trip meeting with Jørn Utzon. You can see Jørn Utzon there on the, with Korsmo and his wife, Greg Korsmo. They traveled out west and down through Mexico and Guatemala, and Kahn boarded a ship for Europe some months later. Kahn's second trip to Europe, or specifically to Rome, was a landmark in his career, as he was offered a commission to design the new Yale Art Gallery while in Rome. And this brings us to a discussion on Kahn's early work. Okay, he had a certain maturity behind him. He has been searching for a direction. He continues then now to try these attempts out. I think one very important attempt was the Weiss House. One can see here that it was clearly influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. But at the same time, it had something within a Kahn identity of these shutters that could be moved up and down, controlling the light in the house itself. I was fortunate to visit this house before Mrs. Wise died, and it was amazing to bring this house into different present within using the shutters. And of course, then the Yale Art Gallery, in which there was very much a discussion in the beginning that the building was a continuation of the street, that you could enter directly. The relationship between structure and light had more or less been placed. And also this discussion in him that lasted for the rest of our life, the relationship between the structure and the structure capacity to take on other type of technical equipment without disturbing the architecture itself. As within these, the technical ducts and so on could go through or in between the pyramids. And you can see here very much a sort of a clarity in order. You can see the form aspect of the clarity in form, and the relationship between different forms superposed one another, and which at the same time works on the light itself. Ann Tyng, that works in his office at the time, was very influential. She was a mathematician from MIT, and they had a good relationship of also discussion related to their work, and in which one of these models is an example of that. But again, it took on a direction in which then Kahn was not really interested in. It became too technological. It became too much away from the mass of architecture that he talked about. This very simple then building came into place, the Trenton Bathhouse, very much discussed in Scandinavia, very much in Scandinavian magazines, of these 5 squares and this particular type of structure that made it. The use of it in the beginning, the Nordic roof, to put it that way. But the most important in relation to this building was what you see here. Kahn talked about this as a hollow column, meaning that you could enter a column. And that was something that he really was in search for almost the rest of his life, to look upon a structure, not as a structure as only that of a solid, but that you had the capacity to enter it. And then this Mikveh Israel synagogue became part of that discussion. You see here in the plan these light sources and the hollow column that gave its light identity to the main place. But the key issue here, which is an enormous architectural discovery in a way, is that the main room then did not have to think about its opening any longer, because the light was already taken care of by these different hollow columns. So in a way, it's I would call it the first break into Kahn's truly identity as an architect. Of course, Toyo Ito in Japan has basically understood this in his work here. And it was interesting to discover or be part of this hollow column structure then that makes another identity of the relationship between structure and light. Then the Richard Medical Building, more than a building for him. The entrance, you go under and you could enter the garden that you just saw on the other side. Again, the square, but the square has a place in between, has some sort of a corridor. But here comes one essence that Kahn brings with him further. He talks about the architecture is a making of room. And he expresses that in the building itself, that the laboratories themselves are expressed as rooms, and the plan then being a sequence of rooms. But he also comes to a very important step here in a way that this corridor in between arrived to in a sentence that says, I hate corridors. I hate corridors. You could see it here. And this became very important for Kahn later. In the Bremar, you could see that the corridor is away. There's a true connection between the spaces, making then a direct link. The light itself is taken up very high and bringing down to the space itself. One often talk about that this was too harsh for a girls' school, but Kahn talked about it in another way, that the most important was the space, that it should give concentration for the learning and for your studies. You can see here the light's coming from the top and is brought further down. And this beautiful little Escherick house, his architecture starts to have a certain clarity. There is no corridors any longer. There's just the structure and the space itself that comes together. The idea of different reading in the facade, the functional aspect of the service units, the living room or the living space that has a protection from the other side, and the light then that is taken in very deeply, comes in very deeply into the space itself. And this beautiful Fischer house that sort of sums up some of the things that we know we're talking about, these two cubes that connects, that in which then the space in between becomes the space itself. You can see here. The fireplace as an important object in the place itself, and also the shutters and the capacity then to transform the light in different ways coming into the house itself. And again, that the light has to struggle in order to enter. It's never, seldom enters very early. In other words, through whatever instrument he uses, the light has to go through that instrument before it reaches the room itself. You can see it also very much here, a plan that has inspired so many architects later, the plan for the Dominican sisters, how things touches upon another, goes together in a way that one constantly discovers new spaces through the architectural sequence one goes through. Then another part of the European connection. In 1959, Peter and Alice Smithson planned to publish some of Kahn's later work, and at the same time sent an invitation to the Siam Otlo meeting of 1959. In Kahn's speech, he commented, somewhat critical of the content, and I quote him, "I believe there are many in our profession who rely entirely upon the actual design and very little on the way of thoughts as to what the things wants to be before they try to develop the design, the solution of the problem." This visit was also the first physical meeting with Aldo van Eyck, whose architecture and thinking had inspired Kahn for some time. His work on the orphanage was very important in that sense. The plan, as you can see, the relationship with the plans that you just know saw. The Sonsterbæk Pavilion. This important relationship between Kahn and Alto van Eyck is also interesting to study further. And also Rolf Erskine presented a study for the ideal town in subarctic environment, which received some attention. Arne Korsmo also attended this meeting, but there was a number of other people there who would become friends and inspiration in the later half of his life, particularly Kenzo Tange and Aldo van Eyck. At this time, Korsmo was a very established architect and had been active in Siam for years, but his thinking did not go well with the Smithsons, as they looked upon him as a functionalist. He did not fit inside the brutalist agenda. The correspondence between Smithsons and Kahn was something else. The Smithsons asked over and over again for material with more and more extravagant envelopes and leather, but Kahn was very difficult to reach. Most of the people at the Siam meeting also attended the World Design Conference in Tokyo. Half a year later, Korsmo and Kahn met up once again and had a memorable time together. This picture, one of many, was taken a few days after the conference. Years later, whenever one of these pictures was published in a book, Korsmo was always referred to as unknown. Kahn made a Scandinavian lecture tour in 1966. On his visit to Oslo, he praised the vernacular architecture and the Viking boats and joked that the Oslo tone had stolen his ideas. At this point in time, he was a well-established architect with many prestigious commissions. Later in Elaud, here's from his Oslo trip. Later in Elaud, we have Siam, we have Team 10, and out of Team 10 came Elaud, the International Laboratory of Architecture and Urban Design, headed by Giancarlo Di Carlo, and supported by his friend from Siam and Team 10. In a time, this would occasionally take up issues on Kahn legacy, and even there was difficult in placing his work. It was often tied to the postmodernist movement. So, even as late as 1920, 2000, Kahn's legacy, Kahn's architectural legacy, was not really in place. And during my 18 years participation in Elaud, this was an ongoing discussion. This is a studio we had at Penn. And Kahn said, "I teach myself when I teach others." This deep focus upon understanding or sensing the core beginning of any architectural project was also a key element in the classroom. It was important to get in touch with our creative process, Within each assignment, finding the architectural core in the project was a challenge. And to express this core, what was it called? A form drawing. Here we see a typical example of Kahn. He could never really rest. He could never really sit on a table, on a chair in a comfortable way. He always sat on the edge. For him, what was more important than how and why? This, among other words and phrases like, the most powerful thing have is wonder, our capacity to wonder, that knowing that belongs to your inner thoughts is more important than knowledge, that design is different from form, design is private, individual, it's measurable, the form is in itself an everlasting issue. In other words, this is the design of the shoe. But what is similar for all the shoes is its form. Order does not imply beauty that I talked about. In other words, nature has an order, but just to copy that would never be enough. The beauty has to come from somewhere else, from yourself. And I wish I could have more time on these things because it's really essentially Kahn's work, the laws of nature and the rules of man, the respect he had for nature, and that we never really can compete with it, and that our rules are circumstantial in relation to that. But allow me to 1/2 a minute for, he said, that through birth, each one of us is ready through our confrontation with nature, because we have already gone through all the forces of nature. I think it's beautiful said. And this relationship between Kahn and nature and its capacity of bringing that forward has very little been talked about. The key issue then is what the room of architecture, which has a particular energy, and this energy can be seen as an extension of our humanity. These terms faced us each session, and it was not easy to follow for a young student. And it was a pedagogic that was not suited for everyone, as there were no set answers, no method. And in many schools, the whole pedagogical platform was about to change due to the first hints related to the new powerful tool, the computer. But these were the books that was essential for us. Because along with the Vietnam War, but suddenly then there was a push also in another pedagogical direction. And this relationship between Kahn words, what you now have seen, that there was a push of it, and this other order comes into play, was required more strength from him than ever. Many made daily visit to class, among these Robert Venturi and Buckminster Fuller. It was always some sort of a discussion between Venturi and Kahn. Venturi then in his explanation that if you're selling Kentucky Fried Chicken, the house should look like a chicken house. It was not exactly what we have talked about so far, right? And so the image then for some became more than other. But when that is said, Venturi was the first architect that Kahn hired in being part of his teaching team. So they also had very much a respect for one another. Buckminster Fuller, 8-hour lectures. Took a long time that time. And as a student, we were constantly confronted with the importance of what you call a form drawing. And this form drawing were at times very difficult to understand. But the worst you could do as a student was to begin with geometrical forms in the belief that you touch upon the idea of the institutional man. The form drawing as you see here, was first introduced in the First Unitarian Church in Rochester. We struggled with this concept most of the year, but then one day, Kahn came up with a whole set of working drawings from the Exeter Library, and we began to understand its importance. Kahn said that life was based on circumstances, but he also stressed that more important, what we call circumstantial events. What is that? Circumstantial events is that the moment, maybe you have 2 or 3 moments of that in life, that you feel that, I really discovered something. I really sense that I understood something very deep. And he asked us to take care of those moments, because in them had the capacity then to bring forward the context of its own. And we should not worry that others copy it. He said, at that moment this happened, you are already somewhere else in your thinking. And of course, to be personal for a moment, I met Emily there, circumstantial event. So, thank you, Emily. Then Karl as a mature architect. And it brings me, did I learn something of that? Just for a very short moment, this was a house I did in Emily and I did in 1991, Villa Kimsos. And I then had been working with Fenmo for many years, the experience of Kahn. But I don't think I could have made that plan. I don't think I could have made that section without the experience of what I've just went through with you. Kahn had numerous notebooks in which he tried to express the beginning of things. For me, it was an enormous discovery to go through these notebooks, to discover his search into these terms, what we now have talked about. And this silent and light theory, which I fortunately don't have the time to go through, but very important in that sense. And then this idea of institution in his most mature work. Like the Exeter Library is one of them. You can enter on any side that you want. You see here there is a relationship between different structural identity. One structure belongs to the center of the building, one structure belongs to the books, another structure belongs to where you work. And these, you can enter. So you go up the stair, you're coming out to this beautiful common room that it's impossible to photograph clearly, so I've given it up. And then you sit between these structures. And you have your own, these are 14, 15 years old kids, so they have their own space within the space. They have their own light in which then they control. And back to what I talked about in the beginning of where do the connection between other technological issues occur? They occur in the space then between the way the different structures are coming together. So they are not forcing themselves into the main structure itself, but the different relationship between structural identity makes the space for the technological issues. And then this building here at Yale, basically the light is coming from top, and then it's this drum that sits in the middle, and in a way that sort of controls the whole planned to a certain degree. Light coming from above, light filtering through the tunnel of the hollow column. Quite powerful, right? Yeah, I put it there, right? But here's what I would like to tell about this in relation to what we have talked about earlier, the sequence of space. You are in one space, and that space has a clear identity to hold you. In other words, it has an energy of its own. But that space is never singular. You are also part of many spaces at the same time. So you belong to the individuality of the room, but that room is always connected to other spaces, which make them a thickness into the architectural sequence itself. Then Salt Institute, I talked about this in relation to silence. It's interesting that Kahn had a discussion with Berrigan. Kahn in this had a lot of trees in the center course. Lou Berrigan said, no, this you should take out, and so he did. And I know that many of you have experienced this place, and I think we all relate to the same thing. It goes beyond, it goes into something that we have seen or experienced out there. It goes into, it's not the identity of the physical identity of the architecture itself that becomes the most important. But what is the most important? That you suddenly become a human being inside of something that makes your, allows your thoughts to wander. What is it about? All matter is faint light, he said. It's light, when finished being light, becomes material. It goes then back to the idea of mass. And this is also very much understood of talking about Kahn and light. That light, the word light had many meanings for Kahn, including that light was the beginning of all things. All matter is spent light. A little bit of this memorial for 6 million Jews with this glass containers, to put it that way, that soaks light during the day and give away light in the evening. These are also two things that happen here. You have the laboratories that has an identity and a concentration of a particular identity of their own. And you have this space here that gives light in and out within that position. And Kahn's work has very few details. And the details belongs to shadow. It's a discussion of light. Here it talks about the bleeding of the concrete, this little strip that gives this little shadow under. And this little shadow, along with other small little shadow, that sparks the identity of the material itself. Kahn works has very few details, particularly in relation to his woodwork. And within the order of light, coming there in the morning is different from coming there in the afternoon. He takes light very deep inside the building. He takes light on top. It's all using architecture or the physicality of the building itself as an instrument to give the light that is offered. Also the indirect light, the light from the small study coves it hits the wall first, and from then the wall, it enters the building. And this very beautiful building here that the Kimball Art Museum, it takes you in under a cover, but that cover is open. And it's interesting, this relationship between plan and section in Kahn's work. Sometimes the plan is longing for a section. In this case, it is the section that gives, in a way, the whole identity to the building itself, that it also gives the scale of the building, meaning that the shell itself, the structure of the shell, gives the scale. And then this relationship between structure and non-structure, in which then the light is coming through. And the relationship between different courts, which have different type of light, the light blue and green court. We are soon finished. Before I go to the last building, we'd just like you to look at this chart for a moment, in which then he talks about the wall. Again, that the wall becomes a space itself, and becoming a space, it works with different relationships with inside, outside, and this then can take on another complexity in relation to the way that you put the structure. We have gone a long way. Kahn has gone a long way from the very simple buildings that we saw in its search for an identity of its own. And in the end, as you have seen the last, he comes up with buildings that has a clear identity of its own. It's Kahn, and it's very much embedded also in the beginning thoughts that we have talked about. I refer now to a little bit that the opening of the wall here, the plan, that there is a cut. And the cut sort of makes spaces in between. You're not in one space, but you're many spaces at the same time. Constantly discoveries as you go and walk along the building itself. And here, it's the cut then in the upper part of the building. The light hits the cuts. From there, it enters again the space. It also goes back to Kahn's understanding of the local, how he was able to bring this building into present. One can continue to argue. When you see this scaffolding and when you see the result of it, it's amazing, I would say, sort of the understanding of some sort of a social consciousness, some sort of a consciousness of working together for the best results. Louis Kahn had a creative mind that belonged to the North. What Emily and I discovered is that his creative thinking and verbal expression connects to other also Nordic architects, and in particular Asplund, Aalto, Korsmo, Utzon, and Sven. When you look upon I'm not talking about the architecture now, but I'm talking about their vocabulary, their philosophical vocabulary related to the building. Beyond his clear talent, Kahn's work was embedded in the social consciousness, which we believe comes from his upbringing, where despite or because of his year in the city of Philadelphia, a respect for nature played an essential role. He would argue that nature will always win. Kahn left behind some beautiful buildings, but within his creative approach, there are clues to issues and attitudes that will be essential to the future of architecture and its direction. Thank you for your presence. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating lecture. I do have a question here. You mentioned about Kahn's unconventional academic style. Was this style sort of easy to accept as a student, and how did this style eventually help you to create your own creative style?
It was not easy for everyone. We all came, was only 16s in the class, came from different parts of the world, different backgrounds. And to take on the language and sort of have a belief in it, its power, was a challenge. But that was also the challenge that he gave you, because in some way you had to translate. You had to translate in your own mind what he said. You had to bring forward what that identity could be for you, because it was not really anything you could follow directly per se. You had to jump. You had to find your beginning within the thought. And of course that was very much a challenge in itself. And for me and for Emily, I was puzzled with this language for it had been on me for more than 40 years. And finally in this book, finally in this book, so I'm able to sum the relationship up between these notions and how they go together. And that has been very important for me, and of course an inspiration in one's own thinking, because in the moment then, the expressive instinct, or the if you even in a very simple way accept that life is to express. Mm-hmm. You are on the start of something that you in the end never will reach, but you are in a continued thoughts of within your own creative process. Therefore, to be in touch with your own creative process was actually the essence of what he taught. He could confront your work, but in a one-to-one situation. But he was never interested in talking about the direct work. He never corrected your drawing, but he talked around it. He made stories, to put it that way. And from those stories, when you had a little time aspect and came back to it in the evening, you understood your project better. So he always put you in a situation in which then you had to face your own question in a way.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And here's a little gift from us.
More questions?
Me? No. You have? No questions. No questions. Okay. So, Louis Kahn was an architect, a poet and a philosopher of space who used architecture to express himself. Our next speaker is Abelardo Morell. His work is also, above all, a visual poetry which is expressed through photographic techniques. The common ground of Morell and Kahn is their deep interest in history of architecture and art. Hints of this can be found in both of their work. Here to introduce our next speaker is an artist, a member of the board of the Louis Kahn Estonia Foundation, and the curator of the Kahn 120th year anniversary exhibition programs, Mr. Urmo Raus.
Tere õhtust, et me kuulsime siin just seda, mida oli vaja praegusel ajal, et mida kõik nagu ilmselt ootasid. Aga järgmine külaline on fotograaf, et ma ei hakka tema nagu elulugu siin ümber jutustama ja kõike, mida ta on saavutanud, aga ma lihtsalt tooks nagu esile mõned ühisosad Louis Kahni ja Abelardo Morelli loomingu vahel ja see ka nagu selgitab, miks nad on siin täna koos. Et esiteks Abelardo Morell on minu arvates perfektsionist, kes mitte ainult ei proovi saavutada perfektset kompositsiooni, vaid ta ka üritab võtta fototehnikast maksimumi. Ja ma arvan, et nagu väga vähe on fotograafe, keda ma tean nagu rahvusvahelisel tasemel, kes on ka nagu fototehnikat ennast nagu edasi arendanud tänapäeval. Et Morelli nagu mõned tehnilised asjad on, no, ütleme, on sellisel Newtoni tasemel valguse käsitlusel. Et näiteks kõige suurimaid ja kuulsamaid Morelli seeriaid, mida me ka siin täna osaliselt näeme, on kaamera obscura ehk pime kaamera või fotokaamera, ütleme nii, et ka fotokaamera tegelikult tuleb ideest pime kamber. Ja see on nagu siis pimendatud ruum, kus on üks väike valgusava ja kus siis läbi valguse projekteerub seinale tagurpidi välispilt. Ja Morell on seda nagu väga vana ja esimest fototehnikat siis arendanud läbi läätsede ja ta on teinud sellest tõelise nagu omaette kunstiteose. Aga see algselt oli see kõige esimene fotomeetod nagu, või kuidas foto ideeliselt tekkis nagu. Et me võime ette kujutada näiteks kuskil pimedas pööningus on üks valgusava katuses ja sealt projekteerub valgus ja kui see distants on nagu õigel kaugusel, siis tekitab pildi, välisruumi pildi. Ja siin on nagu teine nagu ühisosa on ka valguse teema, et Morelli töödes on valgus ja valguse ja vormi nagu kasutus üks keskne element. Ja sama on ka nagu, ütleme, Kahni puhul, et ta mitte ainult ei kasuta nagu valgust ühe ekspressioonina, vaid ka Morell, nagu ka Kahn mõnes mõttes, paneb selle valguse mingisugusesse kriitilisse punkti ja paljud tema kompositsioonid on sellised, mis ongi nagu tehniliselt ka nagu sellise piiri peal, nagu mõned Kahni teosed, kus on mingid tegelikult väga raske võlvkatus, aga mis tundub ülikerge mingi kahe väikse samba peal. Aga see on nagu tegelikult selline tehniline, väga peen ja täpne arvutus. Aga ma laseks nagu Abelardo Morellil ise rääkida ja muidugi, mille üle meil võib täna väga hea meel olla, et nad julgesid sõita esmaspäeval Bostonist siia, vaatamata kõikidele punastele laternatele ja täna on nad siin ja see näitus on üleval. Aga nüüd ta peab ise väikse loengu ja pärast seda loengut me lähemegi siis alla ja hakkame vaatama siis tema teoseid ja saame temaga ka rääkida siis. Et ma palukski siis järgmisena nagu, et siis nagu, ma ei tea, kas me pimendame veel rohkem ruumi vist, et jah.
Thank you, Urmo. Art and Urmo have been amazing, and thank you for the invitation to come to Estonia. I only knew about Estonia because Arvo Pärt is perhaps my most important composer in my brain, and I got a chance to see his building. Anyway, Lisa and I have felt in love with Per and Emily. It's great to have them here, Ambassador. You wonder why I was invited here, and I did wonder why I was invited here. Because Louis Kahn is not someone who I mention every day, but I did go to graduate school at Yale, and I spent a lot of time in that building, got to appreciate it, and I've seen a lot of his buildings, and I do love them. But maybe the spirit of his work and his philosophy is tied up with some of my work as well. So I think that's the connection. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but and his writing is quite poetic and almost like a Zen person. Even a space intended to be dark should have just enough light from some mysterious opening to tell us what dark is really is. So that whole thing has been my Bible since the beginning of beginning photography in 1969. The idea of how something dark can be affected by light. So let me show you some earlier influences of me. The Dürer wood blocks of devices that artists used in order to portray the world. To make it easier to make sense of a three-dimensional world or the two-dimensional world. So these early devices are very important to me as ways to mediate the world. This is an early camera obscura. This is before photography was invented, but a box with a primitive lens, probably German, with a mirror so that you can actually look at the world and see it on a piece of glass so you can trace it. I love the idea of mediating, having something, a medium from which to understand what the world is. And that's why I like how things are photographed. I like the world photographed. I can't understand everything, but a photograph of it I do. So I'm going to show you some early work from the late 80s, where I began to photograph the idea of optics, light, just a glass of Chablis. You know how it becomes a very crude lens. Very primitive sense. Even my glasses became interesting objects of worship. The transformations of the world through optics constantly in my mind. A very early picture that was very transforming for me. I wanted to make a photograph of photography. So this idea of what a light bulb does inside a dark space, and of course it's upside down, which is true for every optical device, but you can even see the filament on the left. That this crude box, I wanted it to be crude, just a stupid Martino Rossi, very good wine. And tape, something rough, creating a very magical, beautiful rendition of the world. I love those two opposing things. And then around 19 90, I was teaching at a college in Boston, photography students, and I wanted, all teachers want to entertain their students. You don't want to be some boring dude, so, look, magic. So I began to experiment with and research the idea of a camera obscura, which has been known forever, but essentially it's a dark space such as this. And if it were light outside, if I made a hole on one of these walls, the scene outside will be projected upside down here. Try it in your room. It works. It's been around since the beginning. Anyway, that's been known for a long time. And I thought maybe I could use that phenomenon as a way to recharge photography. So why don't I try to make a room, like a bedroom, into a camera obscura? Black plastic everywhere, an opening about that big, where something from the outside came in, and I wanted to take a picture of that. That was what's different about my work. I wanted to demonstrate what a camera obscura feels like, looks like. And in those days, I was using film, so exposures were rather long. They were about 8 hours long, quite long. But this is one of the early ones where Lisa and I would wake up in the morning. The room was black, and neighbors must have thought something weird was happening with all the plastic. But we would wake up and see squirrels, animals going on upside down, or see the neighbors go to work. It was this instant magical room. Well, I didn't just want to make a room that was full of magic. I wanted to make a photograph of it. So it took me about 8 hours to make a decent exposure. Things have changed radically now, but these early pictures made me feel like I had invented a way of using photography to speak about itself in some ways. These are some early ones. In New York City. Please do not read any sexual commentary on this. These are very long exposures too, so the nice thing is that in New York, I would start at 8 in the morning, get out through a plastic, and go have breakfast, see a movie, see my art dealer, see another movie, come back, take the film out and put it in a safe place, take the train to Boston where I live, go to the darkroom and develop one sheet of film. And luckily it came out. So it was a very arduous, primitive way of doing it. And later ones, much later, which you'll see in the show, is this idea, but now with color film or digital technology and lenses. I'm actually not using a hole, but have found a way to grind lenses so that the lenses are perfectly sharp on a wall. So you actually see Paris here. You can, if you look closely at the prints downstairs, you'll see people sunbathing. And how lucky to have this woman have a kid with Legos, so this fantastic inversion going on. Early picture of New York City. And this is a room darkened with a hole. This is not Japanese technology. So, can you imagine cave people in a cave full of limestone, and there's a crack, and somehow bison are projected upside down on the cave? It could have happened, because this principle came with the world, came with the physics of the world, the optics. This is also downstairs, and I'm sorry, the quality may not be so good in the projections, but the prints are much better. But this is in Florence, the Tuscany President's office, where the Duomo and some indoor paintings are mixing up in. I love the confusion of it, because it's sort of like the exuberant confusion of styles and geometry. Venice. This is in Florence. And occasionally I have ways of making the image right side up. I've learned ways to do that. So in this case, I did it. The prints downstairs look a lot better than this, so stay tuned. This is a picture in New York City from a very tall, expensive apartment, not mine. And I have 4 seasons of this, so all the seasons have been shown in this with this technique. This is downstairs. This is in Venice. That's the Grand Canal with buildings on a wallpaper put in by this Colombian woman who wanted Colombian jungles on the wall. So who needs Magritte, right? Just extraordinary meetings of things. Philadelphia, apropos. And so the idea of a camera obscura, where a dark space receives something from a small opening, that can happen outdoors as well. There's when the sun goes through leaves or twigs, when there's small openings, the sun actually gets shown as the sun through small openings. So the small opening idea works even if you're outside. And it's the kind of thing that Van Gogh, used all the time. I mean, his paintings are full of these camera obscuras that are evident in almost anything that you see outside when the sun is right. Beyond the camera obscura, I'm a very restless guy, so I do something and go, oh, not enough, I gotta do something else. So I thought about making a tent that mimicked early technologies that painters used to use. This is before photography. Artists had some kind of periscope where a view of the mountains or whatever would be projected onto their notebooks. So it was possible to actually trace beautiful landscapes in an accurate way through these devices. So thinking about those devices made me think about, okay, I'll make mine. And this is an early version of it. And the idea of the thing is a dark tent with a periscope, like a submarine, sticking out, looking at the landscape. And that periscope projects the image right on the ground. And the ground could be grass or stones or whatever. And I like the idea you can be anywhere and have the canvas be whatever the ground is. And some interesting things happen. So, like in Yellowstone, we made a picture of that. And this is the sort of result you get. And what I love about it, as an ambitious artist and a cocky artist, is to say, how many billions of pictures have we made of this? Lots. But this has never been done before, a view of Old Faithful render in this way. So I like to find ways to make things that haven't been made before. This is in Maine, dead grass. This precedes a little bit of my interest in painting, which is huge. I mean, I'm a big painting nut, so I want to be a painter, in fact. but I have no talent. But here's, I mean, this is also the 10th camera in Wyoming. New York City. And same idea, tent, ground, but on the ground I put some old pieces of wood to receive the image. The next series that you'll see downstairs are wood blocks that children play with. And when our son was young, he was born in '86, I began to make pictures of childhood, maybe to discover my own. You know, that's how it works with fathers. And I started concentrating on, this is my children, the idea of kind of a childhood wonderland, where in some ways I was playing with objects of childhood and crawling on the ground with my son, Brady. And while you're on the ground, the world becomes rather interesting as an artist. So a lot of this work from '86 on reflects in some of the work that I'm doing now. In the last few years, I've discovered Friedrich Froebel, who's instrumental in basically creating kindergarten. It was a very amazing discovery that if you give children certain things to play with, like blocks, interesting things happen. You know, the physicality of a square or a circle. And it's now known that Frank Lloyd Wright's mother gave him a Froebel set when he was little. And he mentioned the Froebel sets as an exciting thing when he was a child. These wooden objects becoming things to play with. So I started to play with blocks in a way that is childish, I guess. And I love this Thomas Eakins painting of a child painting. I mean, we all did this. It's not like you need some very expensive, you know, high-end toy. These things have a lot of memories for all of us, in some ways, tactile memories. So, and this is a picture I made when Brady, my son, was little. He and I would build blocks. Mine were a little bit straighter than his, but, you know. So this idea of playing with blocks as a way of refreshing a certain art sensibility. This is one I made a month ago. So that's Brady's thing. This is mine now. So there's a kind of a circular thing, discovering what's beautiful and joyful about simple things that get complicated. So I took this to task, including doing things like setting up a set of cubes, making one picture, changing them around, make another picture, changing them around, make another picture, putting them all together into a Picasso. Same thing here. And then other ideas come in. Well, the shadows become like a detective movie from the 40s or something. Just simple shadows have a kind of a backdrop that complicate the mystery. And so much fun to be playing with blocks, right? And in a way, there's no progress in art, I don't think. You can go back to the beginning and sort of rediscover everything. And of course, it's not just playing with blocks, but ideas come to mind, what's stable, what's not, what aftermaths are there in constructions, the life of a thing, when does it end, when does it become affected by things. And this is lots of towers with two flashlights, a warm flashlight and a cool blue flashlight illuminating this. Plus the shadows of these things onto the back. And they're quite complicated. I mean, looking. This is a triptych. And some of them are just weird. It should not make sense. But it's part of being an artist saying, oh, you think the world's like this? Well, check this out, like the camera obscura pictures this. You want to surprise someone. If your symphony is always the same predictable things, you want to surprise the listener. And the thing is, I've done 46 of these, and there's no end exactly yet. One day you think you're finished, and then the next day you go, I've been looking at a Calder book, and yeah, he was sort of like a child. And more and more and more ideas come. That's the thing I try, when I taught, I try to teach students when they go, I've been doing this for 6 months and it's over, I can't do it. So, no, there's lots there, you pay attention, and things will come. And this is one of those cake things. So I had a city built, make one exposure, turn it a quarter of a turn, make another exposure, turn another. It feels like a medieval city of a kind. I'm going to finish with the three pictures, which has nothing to do with Kahn. And again, I think that what inspires me to make pictures have a lot to do with the way Kahn thought of things, certain beginnings, like, certain beginnings have a genius to it in some ways. And then by beginning a little bit, other things suggest themselves. And so in some ways that's sort of a philosophy of mine, just like his. The next set is my jealousy of being a painter. I'm not a painter, but I decided to try my hand at being a painter by putting paint down on a surface, thick paint or whatever, but making 2 exposures of sections of paintings, lighting them from the side so there's a dramatic thing, sometimes with a flash so that the wet paint is frozen. I'm trying to have photographic entries into what we call paint. So this is the cooning has become really important to me in my late life. Two exposures of paintbrush doing this. I'm not a painter, but I can do that. Make one exposure, then take another piece of glass and do that. And when the two of them get combined, this is the kind of thing that results. I think it would make a beautiful Hermes scarf, don't you? And I think I'm going to end with this one, which is the last one from last week. And I wanted to change the technique a little bit by making something a little bit more geometric. And it kind of reminds me of an architectural sketch. Not this one, sorry. This one. I just made this last week. Bands of color going one way, then photograph going the other way to crisscross. And either it reminds me of Giacometti or sketches for my brand new house. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for this wonderful journey. I have a question. Your career is significantly long, and I mean, in terms of technologies used, I was wondering, is there any hope for the pure art, so-called pure art, in this technologically overloaded world? Is technology...
No, I don't believe in purity.
Okay.
At all. The camera that I use is made across the ocean there, Danish camera. Phase 1 to 150 megapixels. I need that technology to make it look real. So I don't think technology doesn't necessarily affect the purity of the art. It's just one way to use it. When Monet was painting, someone said Impressionism was changed by the fact that paint could be put in tubes, so that Monet could go out and paint it. It was that technology of tubes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure what you mean by purity, but I suspect that word.
Yeah. I mean, it's more important to play with the technology than to be afraid of it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
No. I embrace the best camera and best sensor made.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of buying a fancy car, I could buy this. But yes, and it's how technology is used to end with something that is your soul. I mean, that's the bottom line. That I think is each technology allows for certain things to happen. And I think with what I'm doing now, I have the right technology. And next week, if somebody says, the Danes have come up with a 500 megapixel camera, my wife will call me, but I'll put an order for it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Mrs. Ambassador. So that was it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Professor Fjeld, to Mr. Morel, and thank you to the online audience, wherever you are. Good night, good morning, good day, or good evening, depending where exactly you are. And that would be the end of the broadcast. And for the rest,